Hello and welcome to America's Founding Up Close and Personal, Lesson 6, the Federal Convention and our Founding Principles. We're so happy to welcome Craig Seibert here tonight, who did Lesson 5, so that we can interact together and have a discussion on really some strong points of what happened in the convention.
John, I'm glad to be here. This is a fascinating series, and I think our conversation is going to be really interesting.
Yes, welcome, Craig. Welcome. I'd like to start by saying, a lot of us don't realize that, a lot of people don't realize that it was never really called the Constitution Convention. It was called the Federalist Convention, the Federal Convention. And it was called the Federal Convention because at that time we didn't have a constitution. We had the Articles of Confederation. And everybody thought that they were coming there just to upgrade the Articles of Confederation. But as you said in Lesson 5, that between the Revolution and this convention, these factions started developing within our founding fathers. And the reason they developed this, I think they were getting some buyer's remorse. They were wondering if they had made completely the right decision. So the three groups, as you pointed out, were the monarchists who wanted really something like a king, the nationalists who wanted a really strong national government that would override the state governments. And then there were the Federalists who believed that the states were sovereign states, they were independent states, and they were a union, a coalition of states joining to form the United States of America. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things that happened. Now, the monarchists really realized very early on they had absolutely no chance of winning that argument. They knew what our nation felt like, so they joined with the nationalists. And the nationalists realized that even nationalist was not a good title, so they called themselves the Federalists, which left the poor Federalists, who were the real Federalists, to be known, as you said, the Anti-Federalist. That was a name they tagged on them because anti-anything is just not good. So as all this becomes so twisted, because what happened is the Federalists, after the convention, broke into the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Mm-hmm. So all this becomes like an old Abbott Costello movie. And for those of you who don't know who Abbott Costello is, because there's a lot of young people out there who are watching, Abbott Costello was a routine group, a comedy group that did a routine called Who's On First. And I suggest you go on the internet and look at it. You'll understand how convoluted that skit is. Well, that's how convoluted politics has become.
All those name changes and stuff that went on make this a really confusing time of American history and getting this all figured out.
So let's just break it down into two groups. There were the Hamiltonians, led by James Madison and, of course, Hamilton. And there were the Jeffersonians, of course, led by Thomas Jefferson and George Mason of Virginia. So let's look at who the two different groups really were. The Jeffersonians' key leaders, as we said, were Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, and John Taylor of Carolina, Virginia. Also, James Monroe joined with them and really felt that the states' rights were the ones he wanted to support. And then on the other side of the aisle with the Hamiltonians was Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Robert Morris. Now, of the Jeffersonians, only George Mason attended the convention. On the other side, all the Hamiltonians, only John Adams did not attend. Really, the Hamiltonians were there in force. Mm-hmm. And the Jeffersonians really only had George Mason to represent them. This, as you said, happened because they smelled a rat. Like Patrick Henry said, I smell a rat. And like some of the others felt that they wanted no parts of it. And I think in the end, this really hurt the states' rights issue and the sovereignty of states' rights.
Yeah, they felt like states' rights were so important that maybe they would just make that statement by staying home and not participating. Mm-hmm. But by not being there, their influence was not really as felt.
No, it really wasn't. And they had some really strong and great ideas. But let's look a little bit about who they were. I mean, why they were what they were. Why were they called Jeffersonians, and what did they believe? Well, they believed that they did not want a national court. They felt that the judiciary, which was not in the Articles of Confederation, could usurp both Congress and the president, and they felt that the national court would end up being the supreme ruler of the land. They wanted no parts of that. They wanted a Bill of Rights. They said that was critically important. that the individual rights be spelled out. You couldn't leave it to chance or to inference. It had to be spelled out in quite vivid terms. And they wanted a federalist government, not a nationalist government. The federalist government would just take up those things that the states couldn't do independently, like form an army to fight off invaders, to do foreign treaties, and those kind of things. They really liked what the Articles of Confederation said. They just wanted to upgrade it, tweak it, so that they could cover the mistakes and the errors that were in it. They said the states were sovereign, and that had to remain. If you noticed, and Craig, and I'm sure you know, back in those days when they wrote states, it was always a capital S.
Capital. And if people look at the Declaration, they can see that in the opening sentence of the Declaration, where that capitalization is punctuated there.
Yep. They saw themselves not as individual cities or counties. They saw the states as independent as England was from France. So there was obviously a great regard for holding on to that.
And the other unique thing, back to that Declaration point, if you look at the United States, the U is smaller case and the states is uppercase.
I know.
And we've kind of changed that around.
Well, we sure have. And one of the things that was strong about the Jeffersonians is they trusted the will of the people. They knew that a democracy, where the majority overrules the minority, can get sticky and cause problems. But they knew in the long haul that the people who fought and died for their liberty and understood tyranny would be the best voices to hear. And one of they thought that the Jeffersonians were anti-business because of their stance on some things. But they really weren't anti-business. What they were was the anti-mixing of finances and government.
That's a real truth.
Yeah. They didn't want the government involved in what happened in private industry and in states, because once they control both the money and the governance, then we end up with tyranny.
Yeah.
That was their real fears. On the opposite side, the Hamiltonians wanted the Supreme Court. And I think secretly, and from my perspective in looking at it, they wanted to check on both Congress and the president. Their desire to be a monarchy or a nationalist government, they saw this as a way to do it. And you could tell it that by how they wrote the Constitution, without real limits on the judiciary. They did not want a Bill of Rights. They felt that the Constitution expressed those rights quite clearly, and that we didn't have to worry about the government becoming a tyrant, or that those rights would be obliterated. Boy, were they wrong, and were the Jeffersonians correct. They wanted a national government with powers over all states. Like you were saying, they wanted to actually use the Navy against states that would not adhere to the Constitution.
Yeah, isn't that remarkable?
I know. Here they fought this tyranny, and they're trying to reintroduce, some of them are trying to reintroduce that tyranny back into our Constitution. And they, quite frankly, did not trust the whims of the people. They felt that the people, especially the rural country, rural farmers and those out in the wilderness, really didn't have a quite grasp, or a sophisticated grasp as they did in the cities. Does it starting to sound like today's?
Yeah, it sounds very much like the environment we're in today.
Right. As we look at the roots of both of these groups, we can see that the Jeffersonians really believed in the rural development and communities and agriculture. They were the people that were working the soil, taming the frontier. They really knew what freedom was about and what tyranny was about. They believed that the causes of the revolution were the causes that should be in our documents. Liberty, individual rights, freedom, state sovereignty. They totally opposed a national bank. They knew, once again, that if the federal government ever got their hands on the control of all the finances as well as the laws, that we were in for a rough ride. And they believed that this experiment of 13 different states and how they administer government and religion and all those other things that make up a society would really be a great experimental ground for what other states could do. And that people would vote not only by their votes, but by their feet, and leave the states to go to other states.
And we speak of this in this series about how these entrepreneurial republics that would be states could try different initiatives, legislative processes, and if they were successful, just as you said, other states could view these experiments in liberty and adopt those things that made sense and shun those things that didn't work out. A real entrepreneurial and experimentation on American Republic.
And as we said before in this, one of the other lessons is that each state had its own religious beliefs. I mean, one was Baptist, one was Methodist, one was Anglican, one was, Catholics were welcome in Maryland. So the states, it wasn't that you can't create a religion in the states. They did that. It was that the federal government could not create a church.
That's right.
So they wanted those things held, and that's why they wanted the states to be independent. If you're looking in today's terminology and terms, you would call the Jeffersonians the populist movement of their day. Now, when we look at the Hamiltonians, they're very much more interested in the mercantile and the seaports and the cities and what they can bring, and really the law should focus on that. And that's where the area really was importance, and not the rural areas. So you can see there's a complete difference, much like today.
Yes.
They distrusted the will of the people. They really felt that the will of the people, they fought hard, they did hard, but it could be whimsical. And Hamiltonians really just felt that they had to have a off switch for the will of the people. And when we look at the national bank and not wanting a national bank on the Jeffersonian side, actually Hamilton and Robert Morris actually started the first national bank, which failed because people didn't want to support a national bank.
Right.
It was later reactivated as the Federal Reserve under Wilson.
Yeah.
So it did come into being finally. And like we said just previously a little while ago, that they really wanted the Navy and the armed forces to be able to control the states if the states did not comply with the will of the federal government. So if you're looking at the Hamiltonians, what they would be called under today's term is the establishment. So there you see nothing's really changed.
The more they say things change, the more they stay the same.
And we look at more of the roots of these two groups. The Jeffersonians definitely feared the tyranny and favored liberty. They knew that any kind of control by a federal government that have the control of everything will end up leading to tyranny, because the power and the money become the driving force. And we're going to hear more from you in a later presentation. The Jeffersonians thought our government should reflect the basic heart of the revolution. I mean, they fought for the liberties. They fought for the freedom to be able to defend themselves, to protect their families, to make a living, to not have their every move taxed and controlled. That independence and that sovereignty of the states and the individual was important to maintain.
Yeah.
They really only wanted to upgrade the Articles of Confederation and plug the leaks that were in it, like not being able to form an army and fund it. And as you saw from the Revolution, they couldn't even repay the debts to the people they owed the debts to in the colonies. So they wanted those things plugged, but everything else sort of left the same with the state sovereignty. Under the Hamiltonians, though, their roots, they, like we said, they feared anarchy. They feared that if the people rose up against the British government, they could certainly rise up against the new American government if they felt that the American government was tyranny. Well, the Declaration says such. Jefferson says when there is a point where you divide yourself from a tyrannical government and form a new way and a new government. And they realized that the Americans were capable of doing that. They had just defeated the greatest army in the world up to that point. So Hamiltonians wanted a form of government that wasn't quite like the ones they just defeated, but more reflected what it was, with a more control at the top. They, like you said in the lesson 5, they wanted Washington president for life, and they wanted Washington to be able to appoint every state senator for life. So really what we're doing is building that monarchical kind of nationalist government. They really wanted a whole new government. They didn't come there to change the Articles of Confederation. They came to destroy it. So, Craig, let's look at the convention itself.
Yeah.
There were 74 delegates invited. Of the 74, only 55 showed up.
Yeah.
And of the 55 that showed up, only 30 stayed for the whole convention.
Yeah. And this is over multiple months in the summertime. So, when they showed up, it was a commitment. But you're right. That's a small portion of the originally invited amount.
It's a small portion representing the colonies. And just think, if Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry and those that showed up, they could have really influenced that convention really well. And then something happened at the beginning that really started making Jeffersonians really upset. Madison insisted on secrecy of the proceedings. He wanted the doors closed, the windows shuttered, and he wanted no one to speak about what transpired in that room until after the Constitution was actually released. Let's only use my notes to talk about what happened here. Well, of course, that didn't play too well with some of the people at the convention. So thank God Robert Yates, Charles Pinckney, and Luther Martin all kept very copious notes. So we know what happened in that convention because of these three men saying, hey, let's keep our records of what really transpired.
And that's a great benefit to us all, because without those notes, we really don't have some of the historical underpinnings of what went on in that room and how to really correctly understand that document.
And that's why Madison wanted his notes kept secret for 10 years. So really, James Madison really thought, okay, I need more firepower. So he enlisted Robert Morris, Ellsworth, Rutledge, and Dickinson to join him, along with Washington and Franklin, on the Federalist side, or on the Nationalist side, really. They were, as we said, just called themselves Federalists. And so within a few days within the convention, suddenly Madison says, you know what, let's just end this whole Articles of Confederation. Let's kill it, and let's start a whole new, from scratch. Let's start a new thing. We'll call it the Constitution of the United States. And oh, by the way, I have a plan, which he called the Virginia Plan. Now, if he was there to fix the Articles of Confederation, why did he have a whole new plan already in his pocket? We can see already politics playing its active head, rearing its active head very early in our founding. Madison then sprung his Virginia Plan. And if folks don't mind, I'm going to be reading a little bit because I want to make sure you get all the details of what happened in Madison's plan. Now, he called for a House and a Senate, but both were based on populist numbers, not on, so that would give the bigger states a lot more senators and a lot more representatives. So they controlled, the big states would control both houses of Congress. The House would be elected by the people, and the Senate would be selected by their state legislatures. So you have politicians selecting politicians that represent the people. The national government could legislate interstate trade, strike down state laws that they deemed were unconstitutional, and use the armed forces to enforce laws when states would not comply. And here's the real stickler. They wanted the three branches of government, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative, and they wanted all three of those branches of government to be able to enact original acts or create laws. Just think what we'd have now if really at the very beginning the courts were allowed to start creating laws and bills.
Yeah, it certainly feels like we have that today because of the judicial creep. And Thomas Jefferson certainly called the Constitution wax in the hands of the federal judiciary, that they can make anything out of it they want. But at least it has taken a long time to get there, but the seeds of this were planted from the beginning.
Yeah, they also called for the national judiciary that would rule over the states on all issues. In other words, they could start striking down the rights, the laws, the rules that were given to them in the Constitution if they felt that they deemed that they were not in compliance with what they believed the Constitution said. They wanted the national, now this is something I really didn't know, and I found this extremely interesting, and in our research is, Craig, they wanted the national judiciary and executive branch to compose a council of revision to reject any legislative acts they deemed Congress should not have been making, or that were not in compliance with what the judiciary and the executive branch had in mind. Is this
That's
looking at
remarkable?
Isn't that very definition of a monarchy?
Yeah.
The plan reveals that Madison and Hamilton both wanted a national government, and indeed almost a monarchical national government. And it was more like what they had fought against than what they had fought for. William Peterson of New Jersey said, no, this plan really is not good. So I have a plan. I'll take the three branches of government. I think that's a great idea. And the legislation, though, should appoint people to serve in the executive branch, not the president, but
Right.
the Congress will pick them, and that the executive branch selects the justices for the Supreme Court. He believed in one house, not two, just one house. It was based on population, and the states would vote on who those should be. So all states would have some power, but not the power they have now. Other powers that Patterson thought they should have is the national government could levy taxes, import duties, regulate trade, and oversee state laws. Would be subordinate, and all state laws would be subordinate to the laws passed by the national legislature. Are we getting a theme here that we didn't fight for? They wanted nothing to do with the Articles of Confederation. They wanted a strong central government, which we fought it for. Now, also Hamilton and Pinckney also submitted plans for this brand new Constitution. In the end, all four plans were just totally rejected by the people, because what Hamilton and Madison didn't understand was there were more Jeffersonians in the audience than there were Hamiltonians.
They didn't realize that, did they?
No. So I don't know if most of you know it, but who came to the rescue was Roger Sherman from Connecticut. And Sherman is important in this discussion because, and really underrepresented in our history, because he was the only founding father to sign all the documents for the founding of our nation. The only one. So he understood the components of each of those documents. So he came through. He says, "Oh, look, I have a look." After Franklin's break and they went and prayed, Sherman came back and says, "Look, here's what I propose. Each state would have 2 U.S. senators picked by the states. The legislature would pick those, but the House would be proportionate, so that the smaller states would get enough representation, but the larger states would also have more representation based on the will of the people or the population of the people." And now the slavery issue, as you talked about in Lesson 5, really divided the North and South. And you really explained very well that the 3/5 compromise was not about that each person was 3/5 of a person, but that the 3/5 of the population could be used in how many representatives you got.
Not personhood, representation.
That's right. That's exactly it. Now, the Great Compromise was accepted. Everybody loved it. But before voting on the final product, George Mason and other Jeffersonians stood up and said, "No, hold on. Without a Bill of Rights, this thing does not go forward. We will vote no. We want no parts of it." So what happened was the scream of the Bill of Rights was so loud at that convention by the others that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and their crew realized very quickly that this was a losing proposition not to have the Bill of Rights in there. And so Madison said, "Look, if we just go ahead and vote the Constitution in, we guarantee the first Congress will be to put in a Bill of Rights." Now, people weren't too worried in that hall about him not keeping that promise, because they knew he was a Virginian.
Right.
When he got back to Virginia, Henry would be waiting for him,
Patrick
and all those
Henry,
people,
give me liberty or give me death,
would be there, and he would most likely be voted out of office and lose his power. So they knew they could count on him putting in the Bill of Rights. As a matter of fact, Jefferson wrote to Madison, and again, folks, if you don't mind, I'll just read from this, so we want you to need it. Jefferson wrote, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against any government on earth, general or particular, and what no government should refuse or rest on inference." And what Jefferson is saying is, we want to tell you that the rights are there. We want those rights explained in detail so that they cannot be taken away. They're inalienable rights given by God, and those rights will be written into the Constitution.
And what people don't realize, John, is the Declaration itself begins that process of laying out our inalienable rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness according to our dreams, and that this Bill of Rights is intended to expand those inalienable rights that God has given us. And even more so, it makes the statement in that Bill of Rights that any right not given to the federal government or delivered to the states always remains with the people. So this is a very important item that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly it. And you could see how the Jeffersonians were really the heroes in protecting the rights that we had fought for. Now, one of the things that most people don't know is that George Mason also came out and said, I understand about the 3/5 solution, but I think we should outlaw slavery immediately.
Yep.
Our founding document should come out right away and say no to slavery. Of course, he lost that battle. But it was won a little bit later when Jefferson and they did the Northwest
Northwest Ordinance.
Ordinance,
right?
yeah, that Jefferson had put in there that no new state could come out of that Northwest Ordinance that is a slave state.
That's
It
correct.
must be a free state. So Mason won that point in a long-term fight. And Mason didn't really trust that the Bill of Rights would be put in there. He still said, no, I understand what we said, but I think they should be in there right now. Only 41 delegates that were present voted yes for the new Constitution. Now, each state voted for it. So that's why Madison said, it was a unanimous decision, but it was not anywhere near unanimous. In fact, Rhode Island never even sent a delegate. So the question is, and it's for experts beyond my intelligence level, obviously, is since the Articles of Confederation said all 13 states must approve any changes to the Articles of Confederation, was the Articles of Confederation legally canceled?
Yeah.
So it's a question that's, I'm sure we'll start a lot of discussion in the future.
Yeah.
But Madison kept insisting, no, it was a unanimous vote. To get it over the finish line, though, Madison had to promise people that they would try to do without a judiciary and that would not enact a judiciary. Well, we turned out that he didn't keep that promise because in 924-89, they established the Judiciary Act, which not only created multiple layers of federal courts, but also created the Attorney General.
Yeah.
So we're putting in place a guy who can hopefully overrule those states by taking everything to a court system that had no checks and balances.
Yeah.
And although the Jeffersonians won the day over the general discussion of what should be in the Constitution, what the Constitution could be, the Hamiltonians were very effective in putting in four things that I'd like your comments and discussion on. And the first thing were these four clauses: the general welfare, commerce, necessary and proper clause, and the supremacy clause. Craig, you have a lot of information about the general welfare clause.
So in the general welfare clause, one way to kind of parse this out so that people understand it is it does not say individual welfare. When we think of welfare today, people automatically assume, okay, those are the government benefits coming to me. In the constitutional period, the idea is that the individual citizen would never even have interaction with the federal government. The federal government and the U.S. Constitution was only for the states to cohesively hold together. So the general welfare clause's actual meaning is the general welfare of the constitutional system, meaning the protection of it, and then also how the states get along with each other when they have differing views or conflicts. But the whole idea of welfare delivered from a government entity to an individual is nowhere to be found in the ideas that they originally had, although those words have been translated into different meanings today, thus the vagueness issue that had at the time.
And the Commerce Clause, as you were saying, was really not a method to control commerce. It was a method to keep commerce flowing between the states so there weren't tariffs or border guards set up to stop commerce from moving without paying duties and fees. So they got a complete misunderstanding what the Commerce Department was. The Necessary and Proper Clause, and please jump in here as we talk about it, was really set up so that the Congress and the Executive Office could do what they needed to do to get their offices running effectively. But it has become a general term again, much like the General Welfare Clause.
Yeah, and so a lot of that also had to do with copyright and other things in order to protect people's ideas and to see science developed. Those ideas and the furtherance of that, individuals' rights were protected to pursue those ideas But to your point, that language has kind of been lifted out of the text and then given over to the federal government, and they interpret that language to be, oh, we can do anything we deem as necessary and proper. So in several of these phrases, what you'll find is if you go back and read the phrases in their original sentences, the meaning is actually there. But in today's environment, they get lifted from the text, and then new meaning is poured into them.
And of course, the infamous supremacy clause, where they put in, Hamiltonians got put in, that says, oh, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
Right. And as we talked about in lesson 5, that is true as it pertains to the areas that the federal government has been given to legislate in. If those areas haven't been given to them, then it's not the supreme law of the land, because that authority is not granted to the federal government.
And that's where Jefferson and those other Jeffersonians said that these clauses, these 4 clauses, mean nothing and mean everything all at the same time. And like you said, in the hands of a judiciary, it'll be wax.
Right.
And so there's enough ambiguity in those 4 clauses that's got us into the trouble we're in today.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks that James Madison was the father of the Bill of Rights. He was not. The father of the Bill of Rights was George Mason. And George Mason had written a document called the Declaration of Rights for Virginia. James Madison took that, watered it down, and made the Bill of Rights for the national Constitution. And if you really want to understand how important they thought individual rights were, look up the Declaration of Rights for Virginia, review them, and you'll see really what George Mason and the Jeffersonians had in mind for the Bill of Rights. At this point, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, realizing that the struggles they had within the convention itself in getting this thing approved would then transfer into the general states.
Yeah.
And so they really had to do something. So they wrote the Federalist Papers.
Right.
They pretended to be the Thomas Jeffersons
Right.
and the George Masons of the day. And they wrote what the Jeffersonians really felt and believed in those Federalist Papers. Jefferson even said, hey, this is a great idea, presentation of what we believe.
Right.
Unfortunately, they didn't live up to those in all cases. So in doing that, that played a really strong hand. That played a very strong hand in the Constitution being approved by the 13 colonies. Matter of fact, New York almost voted no, but New York City said they would withdraw from New York and become their own state if New York didn't go ahead and approve it.
We might vote for that today.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the history of how the Constitution was made and what happened at the Constitution Convention, which was really known as the Federalist Convention. We'd like to end this with the founding principles. This is a short film that will be played, and we're going to end it after that without comment because we think those principles should stay in your mind and clearly be understood for what the founders' vision for our nation, of a nation being ruled by moral and just men and women.
Yeah.
With that, we'll sign off. Again, this is Craig Seibert from the Christian Civics Training.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm John Riddell from the Faith and Freedom Christian Citizenship Foundation, where you can go to our site at ffchristiancitizenship.com and learn more about some of these issues we're learning today. With that, look at our founding principles. God bless you all, and enjoy the rest of this presentation.
Welcome to the Story of Liberty. This is Jenna Featherstone. The Founding Fathers had 28 fundamental beliefs or principles that they believed would help the American people realize peace, prosperity, and freedom. These 28 principles are also called the 28 Principles of Liberty. These beliefs and principles have given man more progress in the last 200 years than over the last 5,000 years combined. At one time or another, we have gone over every one of these principles at the Story of Liberty, and you can find those videos at our website, thestoryofliberty.net. Principle 1. The only reliable basis for sound government and just human relations is natural law. Natural law is God's law. There are certain laws which govern the entire universe, and as Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, These are the laws which govern the affairs of men, which are the laws of nature and nature's God. Principle 2. A free people cannot survive under a republican constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. Benjamin Franklin stated, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." Principle 3. The most promising method of securing a virtuous people is to elect virtuous leaders. Samuel Adams stated, "Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are morally corrupt. He therefore is the truest friend of liberty, of his country, who tries most to promote its virtue, and who will not suffer a man to be chosen unto any office of power and trust who is not a wise and virtuous man." Principle 4. Without religion, the government of a free people cannot be maintained. George Washington famously stated, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports, and let us, with caution, indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." The fifth principle. All things are created by God. Therefore, upon him all mankind are equally dependent, and to him they are equally responsible. The Founding Fathers felt a person who boasted he or she was an atheist had just simply failed to apply his or her divine capacity for reason and observation. Principle 6. All mankind are equal. The Founders knew this in 3 ways. We are equal before God, equal before the law, and equal in our rights. Principle 7. The proper role of government is to protect equal rights, not provide equal things. The Founders recognized that the people cannot delegate to their government any power except that which they have lawful right to exercise themselves. Principle 8. Mankind are endowed by God with certain unalienable rights. William Blackstone stated, "Those rights, then, which God in nature has established, and are therefore called natural rights, such as life and liberty, need not the aid of human laws to be more effectually invested in every man than they are. Neither do they receive any additional strength when declared by the state laws as inviolable. On the contrary, no human legislation has power to abridge or destroy them, unless the owner of the right shall himself commit some act that amounts to forfeit." Principle 9. To protect human rights, God has revealed a code of divine law. Principle 10. The God-given right to govern is vested in the sovereign authority of the whole people. The fabric of the American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people. The streams of national power ought to flow immediately from that pure, original fountain of all legislative authority. Alexander Hamilton. Principle 11. The majority of the people may alter or abolish a government which has become tyrannical. Thomas Jefferson stated in the Declaration of Independence, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for like causes, but when a long train of abuses, a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security." Principle 12. The United States of America shall be a republic. Principle 13. A constitution should protect the people from the frailties of their rulers. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls of government would be necessary. But lacking these, you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. James Madison. Principle 14. Life and liberty are secure only as long as the rights of property are secure. John Locke reasoned that God gave the earth and everything in it to the whole human family as a gift. Therefore, the land and the sea and the acorns in the forest, the deer feeding in the meadow belong to everyone in common. However, the moment someone takes the trouble to change something from its original state of nature, that person has added his ingenuity or labor to make that change. Herein lies the secret to the origin of property rights. Principle 15. The highest level of prosperity occurs when there is a free market and a minimum of government regulations. Prosperity depends on 4 fundamental liberties, which we have talked about before on the Story of Liberty: the freedom to try, the freedom to buy, the freedom to sell, and the freedom to fail. Principle 16. The government should be separated into 3 branches. As you've learned before on the Story of Liberty, the 3 branches of government came from Isaiah 33:22. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. It is he who will save us. Principle 17. A system of checks and balances should be adopted to prevent the abuse of power by the different branches of government. James Madison stated, "It will not be denied that power is of an encroaching nature and that it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it." Principle 18. The unalienable rights of the people are most likely to be preserved if the principles of the government are set forth in a written constitution. The only weaknesses which the United States has sustained have appeared because we have allowed corruption to creep in and we have not obeyed the Constitution. Principle 19. Only a limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to government, all others being retained by the people. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectfully, or to the people. Principle 20. Efficiency and dispatch require that the government operate according to the will of the majority, but constitutional provisions must be made to protect the rights of the minority. Principle 21. Strong local self-government is the keystone to preserving human freedom. Thomas Jefferson stated, "The way to have a good and safe government is not to trust it all to one, but to divide it among the many, distributing to everyone exactly the functions he is competent to perform best." Principle 22. A free people should be governed by law and not by the whims of men. John Locke stated, "The end of law is not to abolish or retain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created beings, capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is to be free from restraint and violence of others, which cannot be where there is no law." Principle 23. A free society cannot survive as a republic without a broad program of general education. Principle 24. A free people will not survive unless they stay strong. George Washington stated, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace." Principle 25. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This was stated by Thomas Jefferson in his first inaugural address. Principle 26. The core unit which determines the strength of any society is the family. Therefore, the government should foster and protect its integrity. Alex de Tocqueville stated, "There is currently no country in the world where the tie of marriage is more respected than in America, or where conjugal happiness is more highly or worthily appreciated." Principle 27. The burden of debt is as destructive to human freedom as conquest. Thomas Jefferson stated, "We are bound to defray expenses of the war within our own time, and are unauthorized to burden posterity with them. We shall all consider ourselves morally bound to pay for them ourselves, and consequently within the life expectancy of the majority." Principle 28. The United States has a manifest destiny to eventually become a glorious example of God's law under a restored constitution that will inspire the entire human race. The founders knew they were on a divine mission. Their great disappointment was that it didn't all come to pass in their day, but they knew that someday it would. John Adams wrote, "I will always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder. At the opening of the grand scene and design and providence for the illumination of the ignorant, and the emancipation of the slavish part of all mankind all over the earth. The sources for this material have come from over 150 volumes of the Founding Fathers' original writings, letters, minutes, and biographies. They were put into the 5,000-Year Leap, published by the National Center of Constitutional Studies in 1981. Let's never forget the 28 Principles of Liberty.